Hey everybody, this is Matt. I am your professor for this class. I got the list of students, and some of you I recognize and some of you I don't. And so there might be some new students in this class. Yes, this is going to be much different than how I normally do this class, the Doctrine of God. If you've taken one of my classes before, there's going to be some similarities, and I will lead you through that each week. So a couple of things. I'm going to create probably a video or have you read or watch something to engage with material for this class. And then I'm going to have you on a weekly basis fill out a worksheet, email that to me, and then that will count as your participation. So in order to fill out the worksheet and answer the questions, you're going to have to either read the material or listen to me talk. I don't know how long these will be. I'll have to figure this out. So you should have the syllabus that I emailed to you. Looks like this. And so educational objectives for the class: study the doctrine of God, including general special revelation, his existence, attributes, and Trinitarian nature. If all that is unfamiliar to you or confusing, don't worry. We will talk about it during this class. So required texts, those are kind of recommended for you. I'm not sure how much I'm going to refer to them. I might make some copies of a few pages and have you read them. I'm not sure yet. But if you need material to engage with, to read, to get more information, those are good. The course schedule is vitally important for this class. Each week you can see the topics and submit, and it says submit online assignment. So that's after you either watch part of a lecture or whatever I send to you, then fill out the document that I send, and then later on I talk about how I want those by Saturday night. So hopefully I'll get out the video and the material to you by Tuesdays of each week, and then by Saturday night I need all of those turned in. Anything after Saturday will be late, so that I can grade them and tell the office that you attended class. I know this is much different than how we normally do it, and not usual at all, but we're going to navigate together. Under weekly online assignments, you can see the online assignment for that, submit weekly, and I have all the descriptions there. There will be a final exam, the next page. There will be a final exam in this class that will come in week 8. So the class isn't 10 weeks, it's only 8 weeks, which is a little different than how we normally have done it. And so during week 8, you will have to submit the online assignment as normal, and then also I will send you a final exam to fill out. So you can see the grading scales, all of that fun stuff. Somewhere on here, I think it was on the previous page. Make sure you're filling out these worksheets on your own. Don't copy someone else's work. I will give you a 0, and so you won't get class participation. You won't get grades for the assignments. So please do it yourself. Do the best you can. And then a grade assessment on the last page. Weekly online assignments. There will be 8 of those. They're worth 10 points each. And then finally, the final exam will be worth 20 points for a total of 100 points for your grade. So make sure you read over this. This is your syllabus. Make sure you read over it, understand it. If you have any questions, email me, and I will clear those up. Okay, so today, if you saw in the syllabus, we are covering 2 topics generally: introduction to theology. I'm going to assume that not all of you have had a theology class, but maybe some of you have had my classes, some of you have had other theology classes. So introduction to theology, prolegomena, and method. This is basically an introduction to the whole class to get you all on the same page. So with that, let me find my notes. Couple of things. One, I want to ask the question generally and have you think about it a little bit, but how would you prove God exists? How would you prove God exists? Would you just point to God? Would you point to creation? Would you point to yourself? Would you use reason? Would you use emotions? Would you use logic? what would you do and how would you prove that God exists? We're going to go through this class, and hopefully by the end you'll be able to explain either your reasoning for God existing or your reasoning for God not existing. But either way, hopefully you'll be able to answer that question. And then the next question I want to ask is it possible for us to know God? So is it possible? Is God unknowable? Now we could say, well, God does exist. I can prove God exists, but I don't know who God is. I don't know which God is God. I don't even know how to go about proving God, which God is God. And so not only can we prove God exists, but is it even possible to know God? Okay, so this class, setting you up for the doctrine of God, is going to cover general topics regarding God, the characteristics of God, who God is. But first we need to talk about theology. So when we talk about theology, we must understand that literally the word theology, theo and ology, means the study of God. And so every person has a theology. You have a theology. Say you are a follower of Jesus, you have a theology. Say you are watching this video and you are an atheist. You don't believe God exists at all. You still have a theology. Atheism is a theology. It is just a theology of God's non-existence. And so no matter where you are, you have a theology. The goal in this class is that you would start to engage with your own theology, perhaps understand it, perhaps ask some questions, perhaps grow in some areas of theology throughout this class. And so we must understand that everyone has a theology, the study of God, even if you may not know what your own theology is. Now, in the history of theology in the world, theology was considered an academic discipline. Now, what that means is just as you would study biology or psychology or any science, theology was actually considered one of the sciences. And so God could be studied as you studied a plant or an animal. And so in previous centuries, it would be required as some, especially in upper level academic classes, as part of that discipline. The problem was in the Enlightenment that when reason and science was considered a higher level thought to theology, theology was determined as not a science, because you couldn't touch God, which means you can't study God, and so it was considered not a science at that point. And everything changed. Schools changed, especially in the United States. Academic education changed, and theology got taken out of a lot of schools and schools of thought. Let's see. Sciences in the Enlightenment were observations of physical realities, a hypothesis that could be measured and proved. And they thought God can't be measured and proved. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, if you want to look him up and find out more about him, he determined that religion and theology was a byproduct of reason for social functioning. So what he thought was that really theology in itself, or church, was this social construct that was created, and it was a byproduct of the social construct for well-behaved people. It wasn't necessarily something in its own, or even a science that could be studied. It was more of a social influence. So he didn't think that it was religion in itself was something worth studying by itself. Actually, it was worth getting rid of so that he could study what it was important for him to study, which was reason, what could be tangibly touched and observed. Around that time, a little after, but the theologian Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H, defined theology as a science, claiming that a couple of things. One, it is a human effort after a definite object of knowledge. So as every science is, it's a human effort searching an object to observe it, to ask questions, to create a hypothesis, to ask a question about it, and then determine whether or not the hypothesis is true. And so he said, well, both of those can happen. It's a human effort after a definite object of knowledge. 2, it follows a definite, self-consistent path to knowledge. It's not chaotic, right? As we study God, God is the object. And so we can use our tools, reasoning, science, to study that. What we will learn in this class is we can also use ourselves as we study ourselves, our experience of God, our own emotions. Those are part of valid criteria to study and understand God. And then finally, 3, it is accountable to itself and to everyone capable of effort after this object, and hence of following this path. So what it means there is, if one person sets down a path of understanding who God is, and another person, it's a similar path because we are human beings and there is a definite object, God. It's not a chaotic path in which everyone comes to a totally different conclusion. But everyone is capable, has the capacity of this effort to search the object. So, according to Karl Barth, it is still a science. You have the human effort to ask questions about God, to study God. There is a definite goal to the study, an object, and you have the capacity to do this study. And so in this class you might think, well, I don't have a theology, I don't really believe in God, I don't even have the capacity because I didn't grow up in a very churched home maybe, but you can study God, you can think about God, you have the capacity to go on this theological journey we will in this class. Most arguments for the existence of God defer to the need for concrete evidence that God exists. For example, they say, well, you can't really prove God exists because we need a concrete evidence. If I said, God must show himself in power, and then I will believe God exists. Outside of that, who is God? Why believe in God? And so modern arguments for the existence of God have deferred to this very physical aspect of it needing to be a science, something I can touch, something I can make observations of. And therefore, if you talk to a lot of people in the city now, that's their reasoning for maybe not believing in God. So they say, well, where was God then? Where was God now? Where is God in the world in the midst of what we are experiencing? How come I can't touch God? If I ask God to reveal himself, why isn't he talking back? And so a lot of this absence of this concrete, tangible evidence then makes people say, well, then God must not exist. And we need to question whether or not that is a valid deduction, a reasoning for God not existing. I could make the argument that that is a reason for God existing, but we will get to that. I would also argue that every person in this class, that you've had thoughts about God. You've thought about God. You've thought about God's existence. You've thought about how any kind of your religious background, how that has influenced who you are today, or whether or not you should continue down a path of a certain theology of God. And I would argue that there's a reason for that. Actually, it's one of the proofs for God's existence that we actually think about God, about God's existence. If I said, how many in this class, or you watching this video, have you thought about purple elephants flying around the sky? And I hope that none of you have. Why? Because they don't exist. And so there's not this common experience of thinking about things that don't exist. The question is why is there a common experience of thinking about God? Something that some would argue doesn't exist, and some argue that does exist. And so theology is part of all of our lives. Every person has a theology. Every person has thought about the existence of God, and there's something innate in the human experience to think about identity and purpose. Identity and purpose that relate more so to the eternal, to the long-term picture, or if we don't believe God exists, to the finite, to tomorrow. What is my identity and purpose in the midst of this world if God does not exist? There is no after this. But we've all thought about the questions and tried to wrestle through it. When we talk about religion, make a close distinction between our theology and religion, because a lot of people are going to connect the two. Well, I don't believe in God because I don't believe in these religious institutions. I don't believe in the religion or church or whatever religion it is. And so there's this strong connection between theology and religion. And so we need to make that distinction. Religion in itself includes theology. It includes a theological understanding of God's existence. It is also a developed worldview. So it's a way of seeing the world, viewing the world, and how we see ourselves in participation with the world, and how individuals should relate to the world according to this perspective. That is religion. And so with that, religion comes certain practices, certain experiences, certain rhythms in life that we participate in. And those rhythms, say going to church or serving the poor or prayer or fasting, all of those relate back to our understanding of who God is. And so religion is really the outside covering of this core theology of God. But if we don't like what people do or how people respond to other people or these outside things, we can't necessarily determine God doesn't exist. We can, however, determine that they're just not good examples of maybe what they believe or who they say God, they think God to be. That is valid. Talked about that. In this class, we're going to focus on first general theology. And so just general theology, does God exist? And then we will move on to ending in more of a Christian theological view of God. And so don't disengage because maybe you don't believe in a Christian theology. And if you do believe in a Christian theology, then learn and grow in your own theological perspective. Theology is a combination of reason, experience, observation of the world and our culture, world history, and so the history of the world, ethics, and specifically ethics with real life implications. Ethics would be our value system of right and wrong, how we make decisions between right and wrong. And so those are what our theology is made of. It's a combination of these things. So reason, how we go from A to B in logic, our experience, how we've experienced God, how we've experienced ourselves, how we've experienced culture, our observations of the world, how we've observed, what do we see, what are our experiences of these observations, and how do they determine what we believe God to be. World history, how the world is observed in our experience of our shared experience of humanity through the world, and then finally those ethics. What do we determine right, and what do we determine as wrong, and how do we make those decisions? So your theology is a combination of probably all of those, most likely many of those, but probably all of them. Therefore, our theology must include our intellect. It must include our mind. If we try to do theology and disregard our own ability to think, we're missing something. It must include our emotions. We're emotional beings, so we can't just think logically about God, because sometimes our experience and our emotions do tell us a lot about ourselves and the world, and so therefore they are justifiable means of understanding who God is. Our theology will also include our will, meaning what we want to do, our dreams, our hopes, our will. It will include that. And so we cannot exclude any of these: our will, our emotions, our thoughts, or our mind. So we can't just be emotional about God and disregard our ability to reason. We can't reason and just disregard emotional experience. Nor can we disregard our own will, our desires for either ourselves, life in general, because all of those are important and tell us specifically something about not only the existence of God, but God. And then generally, that was theology. And then a Christian theology is all of that. In addition to it is biblical, meaning it is rooted in the Bible. It is systematic. It has a system of logic and connections. It's not just chaotic. It's not just a set of ideas thrown against a wall. And it relates to the issues of culture and learning. And so it's not disengaged from culture. A Christian theology is not something thought of in a box outside of culture, but engages with culture and is contemporary, is biblically first century, but today, in the today. A Christian theology is in the today. We have to wrestle with the experience of humanity today, how we experience that, what is our response, how should we respond. All of that is valuable information as we think about our Christian theology. And then finally, practical. A Christian theology is practical. If it is not both put into practice and have the ability to actually speak into my life of how I should respond as a human being relating to the existence of God, then we've missed something. All right, so that's your introduction to this class. I'm going to stop this video, start a new one, and then talk about prolegomena and method. All right, so we want to talk about prolegomena and method. And prolegomena is a fancy word that just basically means the first things. And the first things in a theological understanding is, what do you start with? You could start with the existence of God. You could start with the Bible being the revealed information about God. You could start with Jesus being the Son of God given to us for our salvation. You can start different places. You could start in our ability to even understand God, to rationalize God, to think about God. The prolegomena are the first things, and dependent on what you use as your first things, kind of depends or determines the method. I already talked about method a little bit in the last video. The idea that what I consider our method to be is that we can use our intellect, our emotions, our observations of the world. We can use everything that is about us as a method of understanding God and discovering God together. And so, yes, prolegomena is these first things. Now, in the first things, one of the ways that normally a Christian church or a Christian theology will start with the argument for God's existence looks something like this. Hopefully be able to see this. So number one, God exists. And number two, God has specifically revealed himself in the Bible. And then number three, this special revelation of God must be investigated in order to determine what God has revealed. Now that is a common argument for God's existence. God exists. He has specifically revealed himself in the Bible. The problem is if you look at number two presumes or assumes that God already exists. It's not a separate rational argument. You could say, well, if A, one, God exists, and B, something else, then C must be true. Well, B assumes that God exists. And so it has the proof, or it has the this must be true for this one to be true. Right? This one, number two, can't be true on its own. And so it really is what a lot of people argue is a circular argument, right? Because in order for this to be true, that has to be true. But if that one's not true, then this one's not true, because it creates a circle. So it's actually not a great argument for God's existence, and a lot of people that are outside of the church would say they don't believe in God for that reason. But even though it's a little bit of a circular reasoning, we must have a just follow. Well, yes, postmodern thought, so thought within our culture, conflicts with this truth and experience. So we must have a better argument for God's existence than just this, right? Because if I present this to someone who doesn't believe in God, they're not gonna listen to me. They're not gonna go, oh yeah, A, B, oh, I must read the Bible because it is a special revelation. It just doesn't work. What we must understand is that we are complex beings with the emotion, the thought, our experience, and our arguments for God's existence and our theology must include all of those aspects. The progression of a postmodern thought, or thought that we have within our culture today, is really an extension of the philosophical thought of the 19th century that continued through existentialism, so basically questioning who I am. Can I think about God? If do I exist? Am I just part of this whole system? And so that led to every truth being subjective, meaning there is no ultimate truth, according to this a postmodern thought process that has been extended through this philosophy of the 19th century. If that's the case, then if all truth is subjective, and I would create an argument for God's existence, then people just say, well, that's your truth. That I don't need to believe that because that's not true. It's just you. And so if there is no objective truth, there is no truth that is not just subjective based on our own experience of it or our own perception, perspective, then they're right. They're right. The search for God's existence doesn't help us, is futile, because all our experiences of God would just merely be subjective, which means God himself would be unknowable, and that we couldn't even have this relationship or even know who God is or even prove that God exists. However, I would argue that there must be an objective truth. So you could say, wherever you are watching this video, and hopefully you're watching this video, wherever you are you there? Right? You could say, well, I'm not there. I'm in an entirely different world. But you could say, well, you are there watching this video, wherever you are. If you are able to say that, then that is an objective truth, right? If you can say one thing is objectively true, then there must be other truth that is objective. Not all truth is subjective, therefore. And if that is the case, then there must be at least a way to argue for a objective truth of God that is not just our experience of God, and therefore God can be knowable, and we can engage in this process of theology. And so that would be prolegomena, the first things. That's saying, well, there must be an objective truth, and must be an ultimate objective truth. There must be a truth that is greater than all other truths, a truth that is far above all other truths, and that not the truth itself isn't subjective, meaning just determined or dependent upon the person. And so that would be our starting point. And then our method would be, we could argue different ways of making that. Our method of arguing for God's existence. Do we use our emotions, our thoughts? Do we use our experience, our historical experience of the world? Do we just confine it to what we would call religions? And so there's different methods in that. So how we start and how we go about our theology will kind of determine our process. And so if you are there and you're listening to this and you're saying, well, there is no objective truth. Everything is subjective. There is no finite thing that we can know is true. It's all perception. Then if that's the case, one, you would have to question your own reality, your own self. And two, it would be really hard to prove an existence of God. And so in the worksheet, please, if you are, that is your experience, explain that as part of your theology, that everything is subjective. But as we go through the class, we're going to argue for a foundation, one, the first things, and then our method, our process of knowing God, understanding God, arguing for God's existence. That's what this class is about. And you might have different methods. Most likely, the list I gave you before, you agree with those methods. Those are methods that you use, your experience, your knowledge, your reason, church, world history, your own history, things you've observed. Most likely, you use that list. Yeah, if you have other things that are not in that list, let me know. Let me know what those are. So, the Christian writer, A.W. Tozer, he says, the adulterous heart assumes that God is other than he is, in itself is a monstrous sin, and substitutes the truth of God, the true God, one made after its own likeness. The quote here challenges our inclination, our temptation to make God more like us and not allow God just to be God. And so oftentimes in our theology, and we think about our theology, we want to make it safe. What C.S. Lewis would say, God is good, yes, but he's not safe. He's God. If God does exist, then God is all powerful. We cannot make God just a saved version of ourselves for our own life. As we go through this process, therefore, there will be a tension. You will experience a tension in this class, hopefully, as you think through your theology, think through the existence of God. There will be a tension in understanding and letting go of certain things, of what we've learned over the years about God, or what we hold on to about our understanding of God, and to be open. The goal of this class is that you would be open to, as you learn and the information, you be open to processing your own theology. That would be the goal. If you walk out of this class, even though it's an online class, if you walk out of this class and you haven't wrestled through something about what you believe in your own theology, then I have done you a disservice. We also want to make God relatable, often to our culture, our experience, even our logic. And there's this difference between our image of God and our concept of God. Our image of God would be what we would say if I said describe God. That would be our image of God. Our concept of God would be your... If I said, how do you relate to God, then how you relate tells me something about what you believe God to be like. And oftentimes those are also in tension, that we don't necessarily, what I say I believe and how I respond to what I believe don't line up. And so sometimes that tension will actually point us to something we need to notice about our theology, whether or not it is what we should align our lives to, perhaps what we say we believe, or whether or not we truly believe what we say we believe. There's some kind of what we would call an experiential tension in our theology there. So our goal here in this class will be to theologically be rational, also experiential, that we can reflect and know our experiences as part of our theological process, and as well biblically. We will look in the Bible in terms of what it says about God, what it says about God's existence, God's attributes, his nature, how God responds, because I think those things are helpful for us. They're insightful as we look to the existence of God. Who it says God is going to be helpful for us as we process. And then finally, I'll end today in the series of videos here with what's called Pascal's wager. And Pascal's wager, he says, if the evidence is equal that God does exist and does not exist. So if I have evidence for God's existence and I have evidence for God not existing, and those two things are equal, you would be a fool not to believe that he does exist. For the benefit of his existence outweighs the implications if he does not. So what is it saying? These two things are equal. You would be a fool not to believe God exists. Why? Because if he doesn't exist, you lose everything. If you believe God exists and he does not, you don't lose anything. If you believe God does not exist and he does, you lose everything. And so that's Pascal's wager. Why would you not just believe God's existence then, if those two things are equal? And then finally, the fact that we can know God is strictly a Christian theological concept. Yes, we are going to study about God. And a lot of religions will talk about studying about God or knowing about God. But actually knowing God, this personal dynamic, this intimate relationship that we can have with God, is really a Christian theology. And that's what makes a Christian theology unique. And then we will talk about that and the dynamics of that. And so as you process, yes, engage with your theology. How has it started? What started it? What do you believe and how did you believe it? Where did it come from? And just be aware. This first week, be aware of your own theology. What has informed it? And so as we progress, you can continue to engage and ask those questions.